Hello, and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. And we have a special episode for you guys. It's going to be a slightly different format. So for all of our free podcast viewers and listeners, you're going to get your money's worth today. The idea came up during the last podcast that we were talking about conferences, and I had mentioned that I had done a talk that seemed to go over pretty well about trying to understand what's happening with the Trump administration and as a way of interpreting what might happen next. So that's what we're going to try to cover today, but it's different. It's much more policy-based. It's not going to be directly tied to ed tech per se, and it's going to be a little bit more of an informal presentation of what was shared at a conference and is planned to be shared potentially at ASU GSV. We'll see how that goes. But so we're going to have a different format for our listeners. But speaking of conferences, and I just saw this morning, did you guys, well, none of us have gone to South by Southwest for a while. Did you see they're canceling the music 4-day session for South by Southwest?
No.
Yeah.
What reason did they give?
Well, you wouldn't visit them and go backstage.
Yeah.
No, true.
They didn't really say. So keep in mind, the way South by Southwest started was really a music festival, and then it grew into this big event, and then they separated out, and I think they had a 4-day music thing, and the number of musical acts had gone from, first of all, 2,000 down to 1,000. So they still have a lot of people, but they're actually, by 2026, they're not going to have the music portion. So conferences are changing. I'm not fully sure why it is. I just thought about that, Neil, when you were saying that you don't like going to events if you're not invited and have a backstage pass for it.
Yeah, I'm very bougie like that. I just, unless I can, get in ahead of the queue, then, I'm unlikely to invest.
I must say that one of the best conference experiences I've ever had I was at a Sakai conference a few years ago, like some years ago when I was still at California, and I was going to stay the weekend in Austin afterwards. And as the Sakai people left, they were replaced by all these musicians. And it turned out that the North American Folk Music Festival was going to happen in the hotel, which I stayed for and participated in, and it was awesome.
But I just thought about that, and because Neil and I were talking online about the London EdTech Week, which he has not attended yet, but they are on notice to invite you for next year, Neil.
Yeah. Hopefully that Access All Areas passes in the post.
All right, so let's actually jump into it since we'll see how this conversation goes, and with a different format. So I'll describe, essentially run through what I've presented, but things change so quickly. I've already been changing up for my next presentation, which is Wednesday, by the way. This is becoming my shtick, Morgan. And love to just get a discussion. It'll actually help me improve sort of the message and answer questions. So I appreciate the time to do this. I guess everything, if you're talking particularly Trump administration in education in particular, I mean, that's a dangerous topic. That's where I was joking at the conference that when I agreed to do that, it was back on December 5th, and it was not since the inauguration. So I didn't know just how dangerous that talk would be. But I think the right way to set the stage and sort of the underlying assumption or thesis behind what I'm presenting so that people can understand is to make a comparison to what we've been covering the past 2 to 3 years. So if you look at the Arnold Ventures Funded Coalition, Morgan and I have covered that pretty extensively. We wrote about how it's a different set of behaviors. These groups were highly coordinated. They seemed to be driving policy, and so much of it was directed initially towards the OPM market, but then, and I keep calling out Morgan's seminal post because it really was that online was the target. And so we wrote about that a lot. One thing that was interesting is quite often I would have people privately talk to me saying, Phil, follow the money, see how they're funding. Essentially, even suggesting that Arnold Ventures might be shorting 2U stock, that there was a financial incentive for them to be driving the policy that they were driving. And I had that in a number of ways. I'm not sure if you ever heard that line of argument, Morgan.
No, I never heard that one.
Yeah, well, I heard it numerous times, and I get it. I did some looking. It was nothing obvious, but I didn't pursue it too far. And part of the reason was, and by the way, I have to say, if it comes out that there was some hidden financial interest, that'll be a major story. I would have missed it and we'd write about it. But at the time, I couldn't find anything, and I felt that it was a harmful way to look at the Arnold Ventures Coalition and the Department of Education. They were tightly together. Thought a better approach was to give them some credit and understand their motivations. So essentially, a lot of the way I portrayed it in the end is that this was a group that really had seen some real harm through online education, particularly in the early 2010s, particularly with very large for-profit chains, the ITTs, the EDMCs. A lot of students got left in the lurch when those shut down. So there were some real abuses and some real issues they saw. And they viewed online education, in my mind, as almost a metastasizing cancer. Essentially, this is the way that for-profit education that harms students metastasizes and harms the whole body of higher education. And so they viewed online that way. And so what Morgan and I tended to do, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, is we sort of started with that. We think they do care about student debt and harm. However, when we saw their policies that were harmful, we directly looked at the policies, what they wrote, and what it meant, and analyzed that, as opposed to saying they hate everybody. We tried to take that stance. And there were times where we said, well, we actually think that's a good policy that they're doing. So essentially, I'm applying that same type of framework towards the Trump administration with the same set of assumptions. But I, of course, need to hear, Morgan, do you agree with that characterization of Arnold Ventures and the Biden administration's department and how we approached it?
I think so. Sort of, yeah. I think it was an approach that they had forged in the early 2010s, and they approached it there. But ultimately, we boiled down to trying to say, okay, what is this policy? What are the implications of that? So.
And as I said, even giving them the benefit of the doubt sometimes, which might not have even been appropriate, but then saying they're bad assumptions they're using. We kept using the phrase unintended consequences because quite often, hey, this is going to cause harm, but it's not necessarily what they want. And so I'm stating up front that that's sort of my approach with the Trump administration as well. If you're a higher education leader and you want to understand what might happen in the next few years, what's going to happen next, it's far better to take this type of approach. Not do the hair on fire reaction that the vast majority of higher education is doing right now, but at least try to do some critical thinking and try to figure out what's happening next. Now, maybe your advocacy is going to be different, but if you want to know what's happening next, you have to, what I would say, you're not even playing chess. Could you at least play checkers and think 2 moves instead of 1 move? What I've been working on is I've been doing some of this research just by typical stuff we do, reading, going through the stuff, reading the source documents. But also I've been going to conferences and meeting with key players. So I've heard firsthand from the chair of the House committee. I've heard from the key education advisor to the Trump administration. I've heard the 2 key House congressional staff working on education issues. Bobby Scott, who's the leading Democrat on the House Education Committee, although he didn't really say much, unfortunately. But so I've been trying to hear from these people directly. I have not met with Secretary McMahon. It might be my wrestling video I put in one of the blog posts where she got dropped.
I get where you're coming from, and you're kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like this is a slightly more dispassionate analysis of what the different parties are doing. You mentioned Arnold Ventures, and you kind of nodded to the fact that Arnold Ventures' motives are, that you'd kind of evaluated some of their motives as being kind of positive and stuff. But And I get that. I always think of education as a fundamentally contested space, and therefore, for me, whether it's the different agencies involved, government, or even just the news reporting websites or whatever, for me, identifying kind of what their agenda is in broad brush terms feels important as well in terms of evaluating what's happening. Now, I guess, does that present...
By the way, that is part of what I'm going to be talking about.
Okay, that's fine. I just wondered whether that presented a particular issue in this case because it's a bit more, I don't know, emotive or a bit more extreme, or...
No, you want to know what it's tougher in this case is I think the vast majority of people hearing me don't believe it, even though it's in writing. It was easier with the Biden administration and Arnold Ventures to be able to say, you know, they do care about student debt and they aren't trying to kill online education. A lot of times they just don't know what they're doing. It was easier to say that than what I'm saying right now. Not because you can't pull out the themes. It's because people are so emotional right now and don't accept it or are having trouble accepting it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I guess, well, let's go to your question, first of all. One of the things that I find is that they are remarkably transparent, not just transparent. If you talk to the administration, the Department of Ed, congressional leaders on the Republican side, there's a remarkable consistency about themes and what they want to get done. Like, this team has been working together behind the scenes. It's completely different than 2017. But beyond a few non-negotiables, and in those DEI, anti-Semitism, fraud, waste, and abuse, beyond a few non-negotiables, there's actually a lot of unknowns, but in a good way, as in we want to hear from schools to figure out how to implement this the right way. So you're starting to get this yin and yang, like very organized and consistent, but a lot of things haven't been figured out. But you also have this yin and yang where you have, and I'm trying to figure out how to show it in one slide, you have the chaos coming from President Trump and Elon Musk, and everybody's reacting to that. But you had this other side that's more on the legislative and Department of Ed, although some of that's changed in the past week, that's much more calm and figuring out how to get, what should we do next, and we're not pretending we have the answers. And they're united, but people don't see that. They only tend to see the chaos. And here's another pop culture reference. I'm trying to look at, like, on one side, you have the Tasmanian Devil from the Bugs Bunny cartoon. On the other hand, you have Bugs Bunny, who's more calculating and holding things back, but they're working together, and everybody's focusing on the chaos, but missing the holistic picture. There's another thing, I guess, let me get this out here, and it's so key, and I'll be honest, I'm surprised that this isn't being taken into account. President Trump, he's written The Art of the Deal. He's all about negotiating. He's all about himself. He's about power politics. And he's written extensively about how he works. I have this quote from The Art of the Deal. My style of deal making is quite simple and straightforward. I aim very high, and then I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing to get what I'm after. Sometimes I settle for less than I sought. And then in most cases, I still end up with what I want. But he's got this thing of you negotiate by you go too far, get everybody to react to that. And quite often then you come in with a resolution. And he said, if I had just gone for that end state from the beginning, everybody would have complained about that. So there's an obvious 2 or 3 step negotiation that he always talks about. But he also doesn't care about details. Elon Musk is an engineer, and he does care about details, so they're an interesting team. But if you look, he's in the Walter Isaacson biography, they talked a lot about how he's got this algorithm he uses for organizations and how to simplify them, make them more efficient. Step number 2, remove any unnecessary steps. Delete parts of the process that aren't necessary. Then he said, you may have to add back parts or processes later. In fact, if you do not If you do not end up adding back at least 10% of them, then you didn't delete enough. So the point is they very deliberately create a lot of noise, do things here, and then there's always a step two. You know, you accuse me of being dispassionate. I'll be honest, I get really frustrated how much of higher education can at least focus on what's step two. For this to be a healthy conversation, there should be a negotiation that looks at second steps.
I'm just interested on the last point that you made about the frustrations that you face with higher ed, and correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but their ability to kind of step back and not react, but actually think. But it feels like that's slightly at odds with the strategy that he's employing, or that you suggested that he employs from the art of the deal, which is to kind of create that furore. So I feel like there's just an interesting tension there, isn't there, between, you know, that is the response that he's probably looking for, and therefore, whilst I completely concur with your point, and all of the stuff that I observe over here in terms of just general commentary on what's happening politically in the US, you know, often says, you know, look at what's happening, not what's said. Essentially, this is the kind of the mantra over here. But I've got a degree of sympathy with those people, because that is an element of the strategy, isn't it? And it's what makes it so confusing that people are, you know, perennially having this debate over here around, you know, the psychology and what's really going on. And that seems an element of the strategy, and therefore, you know, some people might be forgiven for going down that route. But yeah, I'm of your mind on this, but then that's more my inclination anyway.
I wonder, though, whether you're underestimating the extent to which institutions are trying to play to step two. You know, I know you said that you'd heard that they weren't doing a lot of lobbying and they should be doing lobbying, but speaking to institutions, a lot of them are sitting down, trying to see the broader strategy, trying to see the opportunities, really working the refs, and doing that kind of thing. So I think there's probably more of that step two kind of solution thing going on than maybe you give them credit for.
And just to point out the lobbying, that part I should share with listeners, the trend towards institutional accountability, which follows along the lines of a gainful employment type of rule. What you heard, if you had read the campaign rhetoric ahead of time, you would think that would already be rescinded once they came out. But really, it's both Republicans and Democrats that are both pushing for institutional accountability. What is the return on investment? Can students pay their debt off, et cetera? And what I've heard is, since they're trying to figure out what is the next step of accountability, it was from regulators saying, we can't believe we're not hearing from schools. That's where some of that comes from. But I think you're entirely right. There could be a lot more step two positioning by schools, working the refs. I like the way you described that. There might be a lot more of it than I'm giving them credit for.
The other sort of thing I think you need to think about is, like, there aren't just two parties here or three parties. It's not just Trump and Musk and then Congress and then the institutions. There's also a whole collection of activists as well. You know, yes. So Chris Rufo and all those folks, the Anti-DEI and they're playing a role in there. So you've actually got a four-way kind of interaction. You know, a lot of like, you know, this today in the press, there was some articles about the PhD project, which is a very small nonprofit working with some business schools to get more students of color to take business degrees. And that came to the attention of Chris Rufo, who lobbied the government to threaten to cut off all federal funds to 60 institutions because they participated in this, you know, in some small way. And so you've got another project going on there. The other sort of thing that I keep thinking about, and it's sort of like a psychological thing. So if you read accounts of people experiencing poverty or really financial hardship, your decision-making capability goes down because you're so busy trying to keep the lights on and keep your kids fed and stuff like that. So you don't make good decisions. You sign up for the payday loan or something like that just because your decision-making capabilities are burdened by just... And I sort of see some of that in higher education, which contradicts what I just said. But I think both things can be true. I think they're so busy trying to deal with the grant stuff, and often they're dealing with the state as well. So now we have 5 actors as well. So the state governments are also an actor in this, even though largely allied with one side or the other. But I think it's just a lot to deal with, and especially for institutions that maybe aren't as nimble as we would like them to be. It's tough.
On that point, Morgan, are you also seeing, or has anything come to the surface in terms of universities' bandwidth being taken up by just the general concerns of their staff and students that are kind of, coming to the surface a lot more because of the kind of maelstrom that's happening? Presumably that's part of what you're describing as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because of the threat of layoffs and that sort of thing. So, right now I'm doing a project which involves trying to talk to a bunch of universities and stuff like that. And it's just like even people far removed from the decision makers, relatively, are just like, I'm stuck. I've got people worrying about their jobs. I've got to deal with a potentially 50% budget cut. On top of the 10% budget cut that the state just put down, and it's a lot.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to boil all of this stuff down so it's actually usable. And here you guys are, although this is part of our writing, adding in multiple factors that we need to take into account. So you're not making this easy, but I agree with you on both those cases. But there's also an element of, okay, I sympathize, I empathize, but this is higher education. Morgan, you've worked here longer than me, but I've been working here almost 25 years. And there's sort of a, damn it, if you're going to come through these changes, you need to do better. So yeah, maybe you're under the gun, but come on, do something that's reasonable. So that I have a built-in frustration, even though I admit, obviously, higher ed institutions are slow to change, but we've got to do better than what's happening now to make it a productive conversation. And one other point, keep in mind that turbulence diagram I've done, the airplane with everything going on. This is all happening, and regulations are not the only issue. You're dealing with the beginning of the enrollment hill. You're dealing with questioning the value. Yeah, exactly. You're dealing with all these other issues anyway. So it's even tougher, but that requires some checkers at the very least, some chess, being aware of the different actions that's there.
Well, one quick comment. I had a really fascinating conversation with a friend on Friday about our frustrations looking actually across the Atlantic at universities dealing with crisis. And, there's sort of as one approach that let's cut everything. There's another approach that let's ignore it all. And actually, I read a great quote over the weekend, and I want to perhaps write about it in my Saturday post about, you need to actually do both. You need to invest and cut. And it's hard for higher ed sometimes to do that. They tend to be very black and white, and sometimes they're thinking that it's like we either need to cut or we need to invest, and they can't marry those two things together. It's like there's no Goldilocks option.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Neil, you had a point, and then I did want to describe the themes I'm hearing.
Yeah, I was just reflecting a little bit on the context over here, and some of my frustrations is that I think because higher education institutions are they are intertwined with government, but yet they do have a certain degree of autonomy. I think often my frustration is that they don't act enough on that autonomy, and they look to government too much. And it seems like you're saying similar things in relation to what's happening over there.
So there's an article that sort of captured some of my feelings. It was called The Deadline That Wasn't. It was in Inside Higher Ed, March 4th. And it was a president of a college. I'd never heard of this guy before, but the subtitle is Higher Ed Botched Its Response to the Anti-DEI Dear Colleague Letter. And I think this sort of points out some of what I'm trying to say. And so there, Valentine's Day, February 14th, there was a Dear Colleague letter that essentially was the one that was poorly written, didn't define EI, but essentially said, one of the key quotes, the department intends to take appropriate measures to assess compliance with the applicable statutes and regulations going through this whole Dear Colleague letter. Everybody was up in arms saying, well, there's a problem with it. You're just trying to kill anything with the word diversity in it, et cetera. And everybody interpreted it as a deadline day. Like you had 14 days to change everything in your operations or the Department of Ed was going to do something. Well, then they came out with a frequently asked questions 14 days later that actually went through and described in fairly good detail what the department means by it, and had things such as question 8, are DEI programs unlawful? And then they answered, well, you can't discriminate based on race, color, national origin. And it even goes on to say whether it violates the code does not depend on specific terminology. And then it described, here's how we're going to interpret whether or not something is in violation. So it really clarified it. And it tied it back to case, whether you agree with it or not, it tied it back to case law. And his argument, or he said higher ed botched it, is he said, when they said there was 14 days to take measures, this is what they were talking about. They were saying the Department of Ed needed to clarify how they're going to treat this, and that will be a step towards doing things. But everybody treated it as some sort of, you have 14 days to pull all your DEI programs. And his argument putting words in his mouth, but he was saying, now we have clarity that you can actually go through and look at all of your programs and you can defend saying, here's why we're compliant with what you're saying, or here's where we disagree with what you're saying. But he's arguing for this rationalist approach, and that if you overreact, you're missing the game. So I think that type of view sort of captures a lot of what I'm seeing, or at least what I'm calling out, if you will, is let's actually think this through a little bit stronger. So with that in mind, let me now call out what I've heard of the 5 key themes. And like I said, I find these remarkably consistent. Everybody's singing off the same hymn book. It's basically anti-woke, remove DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. By the way, I should have asked, is that terminology used in the UK when we say DEI?
It's usually EDI in the UK, but it translates fine, yeah.
And you don't put a U in there just to spell it differently?
No, we don't.
No. Okay,
not this time.
All right. So remove DEI. There's anti-Semitism, directly going after that very strongly. Gender ideology, 2 genders, and cut the waste. Now, I realize cut the waste is not quite anti-woke, but these are sort of the non-negotiable, we're going to do this no matter what, that you're hearing from every key player that I've talked to or heard from. Second thing is the go local. This gets to the dismantle the Department of Education, push decisions back to the states, et cetera, et cetera. A third one is transparency. Students should know the cost and outcomes of their academic programs. This gets to that whole accountability and the whatever replaces gainful employment, assuming something does, and having that very transparent. Fourth is sector neutral outcomes. It's not get rid of regulations. It is make the regulations apply to everybody equally. For-profits are not treated differently than the nonprofits. And there's a lot of emotion when you hear people talk about this behind this one. So no more targeting, but actually have a stronger focus on outcomes, and focus on the basics, if you will. And then the fifth one is workforce. They don't see education and the workforce separately. And it's not like you have vocational programs into workforce and then general education. So there's going to be a much stronger tie towards workforce outcomes. Post-secondary education should give you multiple paths, not just bachelor degree, but to well-paying career aligned with workforce needs. Those are the 5 key things that you hear from everybody. I don't know how many meetings they have or if they have talking points, but it's just remarkable how consistent they are on what they want to do at that level of abstraction. Now, I'll tell you where most people disagree with me or disagreed with me at the conference. and just really pulling our podcast into different territory, it's anti-Semitism. It's remarkable how many people come with the attitude that are basically saying, no, they don't mean that at all. It doesn't matter what they say in the Dear Colleague letter, frequently asked questions. It doesn't matter the actions they take. We know they 100% don't care about anti-Semitism. That one seems to be the touch point on the anti-Trump coalition, if you will. On the Trump side, the one that I hear the most emotion about, beside the DEI and stuff like that, they're just doing it. But the emotion is in the sector neutral outcomes. That's where I hear people just get so, like there's a weight coming off their shoulders that they've been feeling this way for 10 or 20 years. And there's sort of a finally, we're going to treat all schools the same. So it's interesting you have that emotion on different parts within there. But those are the 5 key themes that I've heard very consistently.
It's just helped me out, Phil, with the kind of sector neutral outcomes. What are the main things that they're kind of eyeing out? You mentioned the difference between kind of private and public providers, but are there some headline things that they're looking to kind of equalize there?
Well, gainful employment, as it was originally written in the first 2 or 3 versions, only applied to for-profit schools and a little bit to nonprofit schools for certificate programs. But it was written to rein in for-profits. It didn't apply to state university and a bachelor. They're just completely exempt from it. The most recent version of the rules that came out in 2023 had 2 parts: financial value transparency, and that's essentially where everybody's going to see your debt to earnings ratio, whether students supposedly get an earnings boost from a program. And that applies to everybody except for undergraduate bachelor's programs, in terms of, like, if you have a failing program, a student will have to sign a waiver saying, I know I'm signing up for a failing program, in order for that student to get financial aid. Gainful employment is different, and that's primarily the for-profits. That's saying you, the school, you will lose your ability to accept financial aid. So it's sign a waiver and have a disclosure versus you lose all financial aid and we're going to shut your program down. That's an example of targeting. There are other things like the 90-10 rule, which is for-profit schools have to have less than 90% of their funding coming from federal sources. That doesn't apply to nonprofit schools. And noticeably, the rules actually exclude distance education tuition from students. So it's almost rigging the game to try to catch them in a 90-10 rule that only applies. So we have a set of rules that are just for profits. And the underlying theme of everybody is to level that playing field now, if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to have these themes laid out, because I think the woke thing is really interesting, because I think it could just mean so many different things. I think I'm always interested in the tension between the manifestation of things that might be perceived as woke, like DEI initiatives, versus the sense in which universities are kind of the breeding ground of that ideology. And therefore, what does that mean? Is this about the eradication of particular initiatives and policies within institutions, or to what extent does that spill over in terms of people involved, the things that are taught? That feels like, both in the UK and where you are, like more like a bigger debate at a kind of a school level around that kind of thing. But I'm just interested in that kind of big cloud of that kind of woke and the kind of
well, but some of that's intentional, by the way. I mean, the language that comes out politically and the initial measures, the step 1, is always vague and unclear exactly what you mean, and it almost invites people to interpret it however they want to interpret it, or which tends to be the worst way possible. But then when you get to actual, not the initial Dear Colleague letter, but the DEI one on the frequently asked questions, once you get there, you actually have pretty specific, well-reasoned arguments. So if you wanted to ask that question, you could read that document and they're telling you how they're interpreting it. And now a lot of that, interestingly, relies on, we're going to have to do this on a case-by-case basis, which sort of implies the Department of Ed is going to be there to make that determination. But there's a different, this gets to that yin and yang. The initial language almost encourages that to be all over the place, but then the actual implementation, which people don't like talking about, is actually a lot more straightforward. So there's a reason it's confusing. And I'm not saying 100% is because of that vague language, but I think it makes it much worse as far as what's happening.
I'm sort of a rookie commentator from across the pond here in terms of what I'm picking up on, but it feels like, from what I've heard, that the anti-woke stuff, the waste side of things and some other aspects, some of those are landing well more generally, and therefore, I'm just picking up kind of maybe what people have said on news outlets that I've kind of listened to, but there's certain things around the kind of ideology side of things and the kind of government waste side of things that people are more sympathetic to, and it's those things that are kind of powerful in terms of if they have a positive effect on how people perceive the institution. It's more the kind of the implementation of those things or what they mean that are kind of challenging. And so that presumably is part of the strategy, that if you kind of elevate this sense that you're against something that people broadly agree with, without kind of providing the detail, then that's kind of also part of the kind of PR strategy for the administration as well.
Yes, I think a PR strategy, but most likely not from paying PR consultants. This is more gut feel type of PR strategy. I think that definitely is part of it. And I think that a lot of that's worked. I think they've gotten people arguing positions that are very unpopular, where there would be a healthier argument in an implementation type of thing. I think that we could have a lot healthier argument. So let me just add a couple of things, and then we'll do more of a general discussion. In the House and Senate, there's a huge issue that impacts this, how it gets implemented. And in our Congress, we have taken, did you guys ever see the Schoolhouse Rock over in the UK? Those little singing cartoons that explain how the government works? Oh, we got to send some of those to you. But there was one called I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill, and here's how I become a law. And we took that little cartoon bill and we murdered him a couple decades ago. Now, when we pass things, we do legislative tricks. And the biggest one right now is reconciliation. And if you want to get the funding, if you want to do something, there's a procedural item where if it's considered budget reconciliation, then you don't have to override a Senate veto. So basically that means you can get 50 votes in the Senate and you get it, where normally you would have to do 60 votes. Part of the rules of budget reconciliation is you have to set a budget target on so it has to be pretending to be all about a budget. So that's where you hear budget resolutions. Our House of Representatives say they have a resolution that will save $330 billion just in education. And that's their budget resolution. The Senate has a version, and they said you must save at least $1 billion. So you have the House and the Senate, even the Republicans, going from 1 to 330. And so they're widely different. All of the legislative action this spring is about budget reconciliation. And it's about, part of the other thing is the resultant bills that you pass have to meet those targets, at least with accounting gimmickry, as I call it. So what this means is that's where you hear very different approaches on the accountability. The House has such an aggressive savings target that they're pushing that the only way to do it is to include risk sharing. And what that means is schools would pay back a portion of the federal financial aid based on how many students default on their loans, don't meet their loans. There's some formula that's in there.
Graduate.
Don't finish their degree. Exactly. And based on these formulas, they would owe money back to the government. That's part of the savings that helps them even say they can save $330 billion. The Senate is pushing more of a pass-fail. Here's the standard, you pass or you fail. Because they don't have the huge budget saving target, they're going with a very different approach for accountability. The reason I bring this up, if you want to know what direction that we're going to take accountability for the next pass in the United States, whether it's pass-fail or risk-sharing and schools giving money back to the federal government, so much of it is driven by this whole budget process, budget reconciliation. And best case, this gets signed by Memorial Day. Now, Morgan, this goes back to my point that you're not hearing lobbying from schools right now on this really crucial issue. They should be taking a stand. And I know that ACE, the American Council on Education, which is pretty broad-based, they are more into the risk-sharing approach. The American Association of Community Colleges said they refuse to support anything that has any amount of risk-sharing. So the associations are sort of at odds, but what I'm hearing, and maybe this is getting resolved, is there's not a whole lot of lobbying going on around this. So there's a crucial issue right now about the future of education and what accountability means. And at least as of a couple of weeks ago, it wasn't happening. It was being driven too much by pure budget issues and not by education outcomes issues.
Something interesting for me is if we do land up with risk sharing, it is in effect not sector neutral. The sector that is going to suffer the most is the for-profit sector.
Which is interesting, isn't that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm guessing they all know this. I think that the for-profits understand this, but they're going to be much more willing to shed programs that are problematic. Whereas nonprofit schools, that's a much bigger issue. And that might be part of the reason you're not hearing this talked about too much. That's speculation.
I think this is important for us to understand, even though it feels quite different, because I think at one level, a lot of the things that you're talking about and discussing are sort of similar problems here in a way. There's still the kind of question over how you manage student finance, particularly when government budgets are strained and those kinds of things. It's useful for us to see, because I've already seen aspects of policy have a bit of an influence over here. Our government certainly talks a lot more about a lack of efficiency in the public sector. And, although it's not quite the same thing, we've had an increase in our defence spending, and that's been paid for by a decrease in our overseas aid budget. So I think there is a degree of influence that's being exerted, probably indirectly, and therefore if government's in a tricky place financially and looking at kind of funding around education, then inevitably they'll have a look at what others are doing, particularly if it's different.
I think that's true. Let me so some couple other things I just want to list what to watch for. Reconciliation. And how that goes, and that's going to determine a lot of accountability movements going forward. Obviously, the big one is whether the Department of Education is going to get closed down. All the language is about closing them down. I've been writing, although I'm sticking my neck out, saying that's not going to happen. And as a matter of fact, I don't think that's really what they're trying to do. I think they know they're creating a lot of noise right now. I think they want to drastically downsize the Department of Education, change this, focus it on a few core missions and get rid of a lot of other functions, and to save money. But everybody's talking about, can you dismantle the Department of Education? And then they're asking the question, can you do it without Congress? My argument is a much more relevant question isn't, can you shut down the Department of Education? It's, can you transfer a function from that agency to another one? That's the relevant question that people should be focusing on right now. Don't have a simple answer, but I just want to point out that's what to watch. And I will point out this other one, even from a story. When I gave this presentation before, this is before the $400 million withholding of funds to Columbia University happened. I had made the point. I said, listen, what's happening here? I do think the administration truly cares about anti-Semitism. So I'm one of the people saying this isn't fake. They truly believe about it, whether you disagree with things or not, or their methods, but they care. And I said, what they're doing is they're scaring Colombia, and they're doing power negotiations to get Colombia to change its behavior. I got pushback on that was more along the lines of that written by Kevin Carey, which is, no, they want to destroy Columbia University and set an example. And my argument is, no, they're trying to get them to change their behavior, and it's a power play. Well, they just came out where Columbia University is mostly yielding to the Trump administration, changing how they're doing policing, their rules, what they enforce, etc. Not very popular right now, but that sort of gets again to why I care about this. If you want to know whether you agree or not, what's likely to happen next, then we need to look at some of these broader pictures, and in particular right now, and in all the chaos.
Well, I was just wondering on the last point that you're making about Colombia, and I have to confess I don't know loads about the story, but I wonder if it's a symptom of how people have decided to determine Trump's psychology, because some of the things that you hear over here is that, it's a very much a personal angle. So whether it's commentary on other situations, and if you've determined that that's your understanding of their psychology, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some people have pointed to something that happened in the past with him in Colombia. So I don't know the exact details, but I guess if you've kind of determined that that's the way that you interpret the psychology of it, then that, I guess, plays into what you were saying earlier in terms of how you react and how able you are to kind of step away from it and sort of evaluate what's actually happening or not.
Well, I wouldn't deny that. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that he has a very personal angle on what he does. Narcissism is often a better used term in this case. So I don't deny that's true. However, I had the point of view that it was to change behavior. Other people have had the view, no, it's to destroy Colombia. Watch what happens right now, because Colombia's given in. If I'm right in my interpretation, that means the funding is going to be added back, or at least largely added back, because they've got what they wanted. If they say, nope, that's not good enough, and we're going to open up a whole new set of stuff to hurt you even further, that would be a different story. So I'm calling out, yes, I do think personal psychology has got to be part of it, but you still have to watch what's actually happening.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the difference lies between the way you might react as an individual versus the way you might react as a leader of an institution, or a leader in an institution, ultimately.
Yeah. And people have different roles.
I think what happened with New College, Florida, would be an indication that it's about changing behavior. There's not a hatred of education per se. It's education in a certain manner. So
the difference there is they took over the board.
Yeah, but it's still changing things fundamentally, but keeping the institution.
I wonder if you might even interpret that as a DeSantis versus Trump methodology type of argument. But you're right, it's changing behavior. But how far and what they accept. So there's still a lot to watch there. But again, my main point is, let's start at least playing checkers. Let's recognize how the negotiations are happening. That'll give you a much better idea, and pay attention to those themes, because I think they're very consistent. That'll give a better idea to guess what happens next and what to expect. But I definitely I would like to grant your point even more, Morgan, that there's more checkers being played on the institutional side than I give them credit for. I'd like to believe that. So
maybe you should take this out, but shouldn't we know whether Barron Trump applied to Columbia and didn't get in, and so went to NYU instead?
Oh, we're keeping that in. Okay. Well, so I appreciate, by the way, the questions and the discussion. That'll help me improve. I'm presenting a version of this on Wednesday, and then possibly a version at ASU GSV. So it will definitely help me out there, but it'll there will be so much news even in the next few weeks, but hopefully at least we have more of a framework to how to interpret it.
Yeah, we got to definitely end this podcast, because I keep thinking of other groups that you need to put in your diagram. Like there's also the faculty who are not working in sync with the administration.
Yeah. This will be, well, you're implying a Mad Max version of this diagram that we're going to need to get to. So we'll see how to do it.
Can I just finally add that in UK parlance, you've gone from Phil on EdTech to Phil the policy wonk. I don't know how to interpret this, let alone what's happening in US higher education. What's happened to you, Phil?
I don't know. Trust me, this is this is a debate. Yeah, I'm trying to figure this out. We'll figure out how far to take it, but right now I'm keeping it in podcast and in conference talks. So, hey, well, thanks. Great seeing you guys, and we will talk in a few weeks.